Sharon, it's been a while since we've done one of these videos. How are
Steve,
you?
I'm good. How are you?
What are we talking about today?
We're talking about Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer.
One of my favorites, all right. A story that's been around for a while, I guess.
Yes, and we're going to talk about the copyright issues associated with Rudolph. So, I don't know if you knew, but a lot of people probably don't know that it was originally a poem that was written by a man named Robert May in 1939. He's actually the father of my constitutional law professor, Chris May, which is a little fun fact. But Robert May worked for the department store Montgomery Ward in Chicago. He was an ad man, and his boss wanted him to write a story because he was good with limericks and parodies. And so he wrote the story Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and you can still find his original manuscript online.
So this would have been right as World War II started.
Yeah, little Christmas cheer, and I guess Montgomery Ward used to do these annual Christmas story releases, and they apparently distributed about 2 million copies over Christmas of the poem as a promotion.
That's a lot. That's a lot of stories through a department store, right?
Yeah,
That's in 1939, and then some weird things happened, right? As I understand it.
yeah.
So he worked for the store, and he was doing this as part of his job. So the store, Montgomery Ward, actually owned this copyright. Is that right?
Yeah, he did not originally own the rights to Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer.
Because even back then, work for hire existed, and so this was actually like a work for hire owned by the department store. So you have this interesting setup where he's written this like cute little story, and it's owned by the department store, and they release it the 1 year, and then I think nothing really happens throughout the war. Then they come back in, I think it would have been after 1945, and May somehow gets the rights. His boss assigns the rights to him, right? Which I find really interesting. That the do you I mean what's with the background there, do you know?
So at the time, they didn't know that anything was going to happen with this song. It would, it'd turn into a song, it'd be iconic and all of that. Um, but the store actually assigned the copyright back to May, and his brother-in-law, a guy named Johnny Marks, wrote the song based on the book, wrote the famous song that we all know today.
So
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 then,
you've got
what happened with the song? Talk about that.
yeah, so okay, so let me just make sure I got this right. So the store agrees to, for some reason, agrees to assign the rights back to him, thinking like, oh well, we already did this, like whatever. It's a cute story. That's it. Then he gets the rights back um, after World War II ended. Then his brother-in-law happens to be a songwriter, and
Mhm.
his brother-in-law writes Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer based on his this manuscript and based on this poem.
I'm not sure
Um,
what year the song was written. I think it might have been around the same time that the poem was published. But his brother-in-law owned the copyright to the song. And by the way, his brother-in-law's company still owns it today. I think it's called St. Nicholas Music Inc.
so you've got multiple. We're starting to build multiple layers of copyright because you've got the
Yep.
story, you've got the poem, which is derivative of the story, and now you have the song, which is derivative of both of the others, and each one has slightly different ownership. So we start to get a little bit interesting here.
Yep.
Then so the brother-in-law writes this song, and then what happens?
So the song gets picked up by Gene Autry, who was famous back in the day, and he was known as a singing cowboy. And so that song hit number one on the charts the week of Christmas 1949. It was a huge hit. It sold 2.5 million copies total, that particular recording. And I understand that it remained the second best selling recording of all time until the 1980s. So think about that for, you know, 30, 40 years. That was the second best selling song for that entire time period. So huge success.
And by this time, May has all the rights back to the book. and his brother-in-law does the song. And of course, I mean, today when we look back, it's hard to imagine that. I mean, this has almost this story has almost the feeling of like really old folklore, right? Like it
Yeah.
doesn't feel like it's actually still covered by copyright, which I find really interesting. I think it's got another, we'll call it 10-ish years left of its copyright, which is really, really fascinating.
Right. So yeah, Justin, talk a little bit about that, the whole public domain issue, because a lot of people ask that question. So can I just use the name Rudolph? Can I, re-record the song? Does anyone still own the copyright because it's so old?
Yeah. So this is one of those that's so old, and they apparently did all the things right, because it was used to be very difficult to keep a copyright. But when this was first, when the book, let's talk about the book to make it easier. But when the book was first published, it would have had a copyright of 28 years that could have been extended for another 28 years. So actually, it would have been extended twice. So
Mhm.
each time that the Copyright Act was amended and extended the term of copyright. This happens to be one of those that benefited from it. So that's why it's still protected by copyright today, because it was still in its copyright term each time the Copyright Act extended the term of copyright. So now it's out to, I think for this one it'll be 95 years from publication, which is a good long time. So
Yeah.
and then the
So
same with the
2034 is when it
yeah, so
expires.
2034, but only because it just happened to have benefited each time they extended the term of copyright. So really, really interesting, and that would have happened with the song too. And then later, of course, I mean, I grew up watching the animated movie or
And
the
that's not owned by the May or the Marks family. And I understand that, by the way, that family, it's nice to know that this guy who was struggling, he wrote the song when he was working for a department store and this job as an ad man, the Great Depression, all that, World War II coming up. He actually, his family, his descendants still own the rights. So that's kind of nice. And
it
um,
is.
it's, but the movie that came out in 1964, that's another story. That's owned by, I think, the film company that produced it. So
Yeah,
um,
but the character shared the character.
mhm.
Um so yeah, so it's another 10 years of copyright on this, but it's a really neat story because most people don't realize. I mean, I had never stopped to think, wow, that this story isn't actually that old. I mean, it is old, but it's not, it's not like Grimm's fairy tales old, right? This is a
No.
very this is a very recent story that has achieved such fame, that we all just sort of assume that it's a lot older than it is.
Well, and it's interesting. So my constitutional law professor, Christopher May, I remember him telling us, meaning the class, a little bit about it and the background of his story, of his father writing the story. And for years, I think the May children had to deal with people referring to their dad as Rudolph and just, hearing nonstop about Rudolph and reindeer their entire life. So that might have been a little bit tiresome, but I'm sure the royalties probably made up for that.
They did, and it's also neat that this is one of those that's a near miss, because if the department store had not agreed to assign that copyright back to him, none of this would have ever happened. And it's
No, and who
also
knows who would own the copyright now if if
probably still the
they
store, but it would just be sitting somewhere. It would have never done anything. It's neat to see that something that was launched as an idea for a marketing campaign turned into a book, obviously was this guy's life's passion, actually succeeded and went through all those things and is still protected now, almost 100 years later.
and it's still beloved almost 100 years later, which is a really neat legacy for somebody to have. It kind of makes you wonder what would happen if somebody wrote a story like that today.